Welcome to this rapid revision session on President Nixon's Vietnamisation policy. What was Vietnamisation? In this table, we get something of a clue as to how Vietnamisation was supposed to work. In 1969, there were roughly 820,000 ARVN troops. Remember, ARVN is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or the South Vietnamese Army. By 1970, though, that had risen by 150,000 to 970,000. Look at the numbers of US troops, though. There were over 500,000 US troops, 536,000 in 1969. 1 year later, this had been reduced to 335,000, a difference of 201,000, a significant decrease. But also look at the evidence of who was doing the fighting. ARVN deaths actually reduced over this time, from 28,000 to 24,000, but still very, very high. It does suggest that the intensity of fighting was actually decreasing, though. Perhaps more significantly in terms of understanding the amount of fighting that American soldiers were doing, though, is the dramatic reduction in US deaths from 16,000 in 1969 to 6,000 in 1970. Ultimately, Vietnamisation was the gradual process of letting ARVN take over the defence of Vietnam. President Nixon insisted that this was done in the following way, though. Firstly, he had promised during the election of 1969 that US troops would withdraw from Vietnam. This would allow ARVN to provide its own leaders to carry on the fight. The US, though, would continue to support the South Vietnamese by providing training and equipment. And the US withdrawal was to be done with honour, or at least that's how it was phrased, not abandoning the South Vietnamese to the mercy of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. And as a result, it was hoped that South Vietnam was to remain separate from the North and not become communist. So in short, US troops were going to get out of Vietnam, the USA would continue supplying the South Vietnamese, and they would try not to leave them in the lurch at the mercy of the VC and NVA. But in reality, did it work? There were various reactions to Vietnamisation. North Vietnamese generals were pleased. Vietnamisation is good news. ARVN soldiers are easier to beat. US generals were less pleased. Generals like Westmoreland, pictured here, argued that they needed more troops, not less. Vietnamisation isn't working, as ARVN can't cope on their own. South Vietnamese politicians were not fans either. They felt that the USA was deserting them. They know that the South Vietnamese couldn't fight on their own. But what about the US citizens who had voted Nixon in? They were mostly pleased. They felt that they had done their bit, and it was time to bring the boys home. So Nixon promised to wind the war down. But fate would have different ideas. Nixon expands the war. Let's find out why, after he had quite specifically during the election promised that wouldn't happen. Nixon had won the 1969 election by promising to bring an end to the US involvement in Vietnam, and for a time he actually expanded it instead. We start with the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. Nixon authorised American troops to move into Cambodia to fight the communists and prevent the use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail to bring in supplies to South Vietnam. He also followed this up with a similar invasion of Laos in 1971. Nixon then expanded the war further. Later, there was the Easter Offensive of 1972. The Easter Offensive of 1972 was when the North Vietnamese Army launched their own invasion of South Vietnam. This was much more like a conventional wartime invasion rather than the guerrilla fighting that the Viet Cong had been doing in Vietnam, South Vietnam itself. This prompted further bombing. Remember Operation Rolling Thunder? There's a separate rapid revision video on it if you're unfamiliar with it, but effectively it was a very restricted bombing campaign to only certain targets. Nixon authorised further bombing of North Vietnam, Operation Linebacker 1 and Operation Linebacker 2 in 1972. This is when Nixon authorised the unrestricted bombing of North Vietnam using huge B-52 bombers like the ones pictured. They provided a lot more indiscriminate and much heavier destruction than there had been faced by Operation Rolling Thunder. So Nixon's expanded the war, and yet he had pledged to make it smaller. Could he go back on this now? Well, he did try to make a move towards peace too. Nixon visited China, becoming the first Western leader to visit China after the Communist Revolution there. Was this a move towards peace? For 25 years, Communist China under Chairman Mao Zedong had no diplomatic relationship with the USA at all. Nixon set about changing that. In February of 1972, Nixon arranged a week-long visit to China and met Chairman Mao. His aim was to normalise relations with China. He hoped by doing this would influence the USSR, China's biggest ally and the USA's Cold War adversary, influence China's support for North Vietnam. Almost every president since 1972 has visited China, maintaining these relations, and it's a process that started with Nixon. But it didn't end the war. Ultimately, Vietnamisation failed. Let's have a look at the reasons why. The first reasons relate to the US Army. As morale declined, drug use among American soldiers increased. There were a whopping 35,000 heroin addicts in the US Army by 1971. Troops knew that the war was winding down because Nixon had told them that it was. Therefore, some refused to go on patrol, not seeing the point of dying just before the war ended. This could also result in fragging. In 1970, 209 cases of officers who insisted men go on patrols were murdered by their own men. The term fragging comes from fragmentation grenades. One of the preferred ways of doing this was simply chucking a grenade into the officer's office or tent. The next reason relates to ARVN itself. Over half of South Vietnamese men aged between 15 and 49 were already in ARVN, but they still didn't have enough men. Where on earth could they find the rest? ARVN suffered from poor discipline. ARVN officers were reluctant to lead their men. There were 150,500 desertions in 1970 where ARVN officers and men had simply refused to turn up. And there was terrible corruption. Troop numbers had been falsified, supplies were stolen and sold, officers were often not appointed for their skill but for who they knew, and also how much they were prepared to pay. But training and equipment also had a role in why Vietnamisation failed. Troop shortages meant that training was rushed. 75% of officers, or leaders, had less than 1 year of experience. They weren't that great at their jobs. And US equipment had instructions in English. Few ARVN soldiers could read them. The equipment was not always perfectly adapted for the war that it was being asked to fight as well. Lastly, there were economic and political problems in South Vietnam which led to Vietnamisation's failure. As US troops pulled out, 300,000 Vietnamese who had relied on American money lost their jobs. Without American support, the puppet South Vietnam government fell. And despite efforts to improve it, ARVN clearly could not win on its own. You might want to pause the video here, make sure that this is in high definition and take a screenshot of that and print it off for your own use, or maybe make your own version. But let's have a look at some summary points. Did Vietnamisation work? Let's look at the basic evidence. In 1970, this is within Nixon's presidency, $18,536 million was spent on the Vietnam War. 334,600 troops were in Vietnam, of whom 6,173 died. But by 1972, this had reduced. Within 2 years, there's been a dramatic reduction in the amount of money spent. $8,662 million have been spent, as opposed to the much higher figure in 1970. There were only 24,200 American troops left in Vietnam, and as a result, with so many fewer troops, 759 were dead. This might suggest that Vietnamisation really worked, because clearly the amount being spent in both money, lives, and soldiers going over to Vietnam was reducing. Check out 1975 then. It shows a continued trend in this direction. By 1975, there was only $1,530 million spent on South Vietnam's defence. There were only 161 troops in Vietnam. In fact, these were basically guarding the US Embassy in Saigon. And 62 were killed within that year, many of them as Saigon fell. But what were people's views on Vietnamisation at the time? Certainly Nixon was promising one thing, but the American public didn't necessarily agree. This first source is a speech delivered by President Nixon on the 3rd of November 1969. This is really before he became president. Nixon is outlining the progress of his Vietnamisation policy, which was a major reason why he was elected president. In July, on my way to visit Vietnam, I changed General Abrams' orders so that they were consistent with the objectives of our new Vietnamisation policies. Under the new orders, the primary mission of our troops is to enable the South Vietnamese forces to assume full responsibility for the security of South Vietnam. Our air operations have been reduced by 20%. By December the 15th, over 60,000 men will have been withdrawn from South Vietnam. South Vietnamese have continued to grow in strength. As a result, they have been able to take over combat responsibilities from our American troops. Clearly, Nixon is boasting about the fact that he's able to reduce American forces and let the ARVN take over. But how did that look a couple of years later? This source gives a different view. A cartoon produced in the USA in 1972. Nixon was seeking re-election in that year. The faint caption at the top reads, "Now, as I was saying 4 years ago." Ultimately, it's arguing that Nixon is using the same argument in 1972 as he did in the earlier election. You can see that he's got a big envelope there that says secret election year plans to end the war. And he's trying to hide from the voters the fact that there's 20,000 American dead since 1968. So there's still a huge number of American casualties going on. Some final points then, and we have covered quite a lot in this so-called rapid revision lesson, and it's been one of my longer ones. Vietnamisation was a key election pledge for President Nixon to end the US involvement in Vietnam. The intention was to replace US forces with equivalent ARVN forces. This was to be done without leaving the South Vietnamese at the mercy of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. But initially, Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos. This caused later controversies, which we'll look at in future videos. He also authorised Operation Linebacker 1 and 2, using unrestricted B-52 heavy air raids. But US involvement did decrease, but at a cost to ARVN effectiveness, and ultimately they weren't winning the Vietnam War. That's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you, and there has been, like I say, quite a lot covered. If it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you're desperate for me to cover a different topic, please comment down below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, after quite long enough, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.